Alexander Gray built his life on control, of empires, of people, of outcomes. But nothing prepared him for the stillness of a hospital room, where his power meant nothing. It was there, in the quiet care of a devoted nurse, that he began to see the world differently. In her presence, walls he thought unbreakable began to fall, and a man who believed he had everything was confronted with the one thing he never knew he needed. Hello family, welcome to Folktales by Imzi. Please subscribe and like, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The private hospital wing was quiet, save for the soft rhythm of machines and the occasional distant echo of footsteps on polished floors. Alexander Gray moved with his usual purposeful stride, the click of his shoes sharp against the marble tiles. He was a man who commanded boardrooms, who made decisions that shifted markets, who lived in a world where hesitation was weakness. But the moment he stepped into his mother's room, the air shifted. There she was, his mother, fragile and pale against the stark whiteness of the sheets, a woman once full of laughter and warmth now lying still, suspended in silence. His chest tightened, but it wasn't her stillness that caught him off guard this time. It was the nurse. She stood by the bedside, her posture graceful yet unassuming. A curtain of chestnut hair fell loosely from beneath her cap, and her hands, gentle, steady, were brushing his mother's hair as if each strand mattered. She leaned closer, speaking in a low, tender voice as though his mother might wake at any moment and respond. Alexander froze. He wasn't a man easily unsettled, yet the sight of her rooted him to the spot. He had seen 1,000 employees cater to him, watched countless people bend under the weight of his name. But this woman, she wasn't performing for anyone. She wasn't aware of his presence, wasn't seeking approval, wasn't impressed by his tailored suit or the shadow of his reputation. Her entire world in that moment was his mother. His throat constricted. For months, he had walked into this room and seen only machines, silence, and his own helplessness staring back at him. Yet now, with a stranger's quiet devotion filling the space, the room felt different, alive in a way he couldn't explain. Alexander's hand tightened on the doorknob. For the first time in years, the billionaire CEO, master of control, didn't know whether to step forward or retreat. The nurse lifted her gaze at last, startled by the sudden presence of someone else in the room. Her eyes were the soft shade of morning skies after rain, calm but alert, and they met his without a flicker of intimidation. "Mr. Gray," she said simply, her voice even respectful but not deferential. "Your mother had a peaceful night." Alexander blinked, as though her words were foreign. He had grown used to doctors speaking in clipped sentences, heavy with medical jargon and sterile detachment. But here was someone who spoke of peace, not just pulse rates and lab reports. He stepped further into the room, his usual commanding posture somehow out of place. For once, he felt like an intruder. You know who I am." Her lips curved just slightly, almost a smile. "Everyone in this hospital knows who you are." But to her, she gestured gently toward his mother. "You're not the CEO. You're her son." The words landed heavier than he expected. Son. It had been years since anyone reduced him to that simple, vulnerable identity. For a moment, silence lingered between them. Alexander's gaze shifted to his mother, her frail hands folded neatly atop the blanket. He swallowed, his throat tight. When he finally looked back, the nurse was smoothing the sheets with a care that struck him more deeply than any corporate speech ever could. "Your name?" he asked, his voice lower now. "Lily," she replied, her attention still on the patient. "Lily Hart." He repeated it in his mind, tasting the unfamiliar softness of it. Lily. A name that didn't belong in boardrooms or quarterly reports. A name that seemed to carry sunlight into the cold sterility of the room. She adjusted a monitor, checking his mother's vitals, and added, "She seems calm tonight. I've been reading to her. Jane Austen, her favorite, according to the notes." Alexander blinked, startled. "You read to her?" "Every evening," Lily said matter-of-factly, not looking at him. "I like to believe patients can still feel presence, hear voices, even if they can't respond. It keeps them connected to the world they're waiting to return to." For a moment, Alexander had no response. His empire was built on numbers, charts, outcomes. Yet here was this woman who spoke of connection, of unseen threads, with such quiet conviction it silenced him. "Thank you, Miss Hart," he managed at last, sincerity slipping into his tone despite himself. She finally looked at him again, and there was no flattery in her gaze, no flicker of calculation. Only a steady kindness that felt strangely disarming. "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Gray. I'm just doing my job." But Alexander knew better. He had seen people doing their jobs, coldly, mechanically, without care. This was something else. Something deeper. As he stood there in the hushed glow of the room, he realized he didn't want to leave just yet. The days slipped by in a rhythm Alexander had never known. His life had always been ruled by meetings, deadlines, and the hum of city skylines through glass towers. But now, each evening, he found himself here, in the hushed hospital room where time seemed to move differently. At first, he told himself his visits were duty. His mother deserved to see him, even if her eyes remained closed. Yet the truth crept in quietly. It wasn't only his mother drawing him back. It was the nurse, Lily. Every night she was there, and every night he found himself watching. Sometimes she sat by the bed with a book in hand, her voice steady as she read aloud passages that had nothing to do with medicine. Stories of laughter, friendship, love. Other times, she would hum softly while brushing his mother's hair, her movements slow and tender, as though each stroke was a promise. And sometimes she would simply sit in silence, her palm resting lightly on his mother's arm, anchoring her to the world she couldn't yet wake into. Alexander never announced himself right away. He lingered in the doorway, unnoticed, studying the quiet devotion that radiated from her. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen anyone give so much of themselves without expecting anything in return. In his world, everything was a transaction. But here there was no exchange, only care. One evening, unable to hold back, he finally broke the silence. "Do you really believe she can hear you?" His voice was lower than usual, uncertain, stripped of its commanding edge. Lily looked up from the book in her lap. She met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she said softly. "Maybe not the way we'd expect. But the heart remembers. The soul listens. And sometimes, all they need is to know they're not forgotten." Her answer struck him harder than he cared to admit. Alexander lived in a world of proof, data, results. Yet here she was, speaking with a certainty that no statistic could offer. He moved further inside, pulling a chair beside the bed. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the rain outside and the rhythmic beeping of machines, steady as a metronome. Lily reached for the blanket, adjusting it with a care that made his chest ache. "She's strong," she whispered, her eyes still on the patient. "Sometimes the body just needs time to remember how to fight." Alexander looked at her then, really looked. The dim hospital light softened her features, casting warmth in a room that had felt cold for so long. There was no performance in her expression, no need to impress. Only truth. Only faith. And for the first time in years, Alexander Gray, billionaire, CEO, master of control, felt something he hadn't let himself feel in far too long. Hope. The rain had started before dusk, and by the time Alexander arrived, it streaked against the tall windows of the hospital like silver threads. He carried no umbrella, he hadn't thought of it, and his hair was damp at the edges, his suit clinging faintly at the shoulders. For once, he looked less like the untouchable titan of finance and more like a weary man seeking refuge. Inside the room, Lily sat at the bedside, her posture relaxed but attentive, a book open in her lap. She read in a low, even tone, her voice weaving through the quiet hum of machines. When she noticed him, she paused mid-sentence and closed the book gently, marking the page with a slip of ribbon. "You made it earlier tonight," she said softly. Alexander loosened his tie, lowering himself into the chair across from her. "Meetings finished sooner than expected. Your mother will be glad for the company." He glanced at the still figure between them, the rise and fall of her chest shallow but steady. "Do you really believe she knows I'm here?" Lily didn't hesitate. "Yes." She smoothed the blanket over the patient's arms with tender precision. "People in comas sometimes respond to more than we realize: touch, voices, presence. Even if she doesn't open her eyes, part of her may know you've come." Her certainty unsettled him. He had spent his entire adult life avoiding uncertainty, building a world where everything had a measurable outcome. Yet she spoke as if faith itself were fact. "Do you always talk to her?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Always," Lily said with a small smile. "Stories, memories, even little things like what the weather's like outside. It may not seem like much, but if it helps her feel less alone, then it matters." Alexander studied her, the soft light from the bedside lamp catching in her hair, the calm focus in her expression. He was used to people looking at him with expectation, fear, or ambition. Lily looked at him with none of those things. Only patience, as if she had all the time in the world. "I admire that," he admitted, the words slipping out before he could check himself. "Most people I know only give their time if there's something to gain in return." Her eyes lifted to his, calm and unwavering. "Love isn't about returns, Alexander. It's not a bargain. It's a gift." The sound of his name on her lips caught him off guard. He realized he had never told her to call him that. Yet the way she said it made him feel strangely lighter, as though the armor he carried everywhere didn't matter here. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain against the glass, steady and soothing. He watched Lily adjust the pillow beneath his mother's head with hands, so gentle they barely disturbed the air. And Alexander, who had built his empire on control, realized with startling clarity that this woman was teaching him something he had never allowed himself to learn. How to care without condition. How to give without expecting. How to simply be. The following evening, the city was wrapped in a quiet hush after the storm. The streets glistened from rain, and the night carried the faint scent of wet asphalt and blooming jasmine from the hospital's garden. Alexander arrived later than usual, but Lily was still there, her presence as steady as the ticking monitors. She was sitting by the bed, her hand gently cradling his mother's, speaking softly about the day. Something about the way she said it. Simple things, like the sun breaking through clouds or a sparrow nesting on the window ledge, gave the sterile room a fragile kind of warmth. Alexander stood in the doorway longer than he intended, his chest tightening. Then, finally, he stepped inside. "You talk to her as though she's still here," he said quietly, lowering himself into the chair across from her. "She is still here," Lily answered, her voice calm but firm. "Her body is resting, but her spirit hasn't gone anywhere." Her conviction disarmed him. For a moment, he stared at the floor, his hand tightening on his knee. And then, without planning it, he spoke words he rarely admitted aloud. "She was the strongest person I knew," Alexander began, his voice rougher than usual. "When my father died, she raised me alone. She never complained, never faltered. She made me believe I could be anything, do anything." He swallowed hard, the memories tightening his throat. "And I did. I built everything I thought she wanted for me. The money, the company, the empire. But when she fell ill, none of it mattered. Not a single dollar could change this." The confession hung heavy in the air. Alexander rarely revealed himself, not even to those closest to him in business. Yet here he was, unguarded before a woman who wasn't family, wasn't a friend, just a nurse. Lily's gaze softened, her eyes steady on his face. "She sounds extraordinary," she said gently. "And I think she'd be proud. Not because of the empire, but because you're here, sitting beside her. That's what matters." Alexander looked up sharply, startled by the simplicity of her words. Pride had always been tied to success in his world, but Lily reframed it effortlessly, grounding it in love rather than achievement. For the first time in years, Alexander felt the weight on his chest ease, just slightly. He leaned back in his chair, watching her as she adjusted the blanket once more, every movement deliberate, every gesture infused with care. And as silence settled between them, he realized something he hadn't expected. This woman, with her gentle strength, was quietly pulling down the walls he had spent a lifetime building. And he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The hospital room had become a strange kind of sanctuary for Alexander. He no longer rushed in and out as he had in the early weeks of his mother's coma. Now he lingered, sometimes for hours, sometimes until dawn brushed pale light across the city skyline. And always Lily was there. One evening, he arrived to find her humming softly as she brushed his mother's hair. Her voice was low and steady, almost a lullaby, the kind of sound that could soothe even the most restless spirit. He paused at the door, caught by the sight. His throat tightened unexpectedly. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. Not here. Not now. But something inside him shifted every time he saw her tending to his mother with a devotion that asked for nothing in return. When she noticed him, she smiled, small, unassuming, genuine. "She's had a calm day. I think the music helped." Alexander moved closer, resting his hand on the bed's railing. "You really believe she feels it, don't you?" "I don't just believe," Lily said softly, adjusting the pillow beneath his mother's head. "I know." Her certainty left no room for doubt. And he found himself wanting to believe too, not only for his mother, but for himself. Later, as they sat together in the quiet, he caught himself watching Lily more than the machines or the monitors. The way she brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. The way her eyes softened whenever she spoke to his mother. The way her presence seemed to fill the room with something warm and unshakable. It wasn't her beauty that unsettled him, though he couldn't deny it. It was her devotion. It was the quiet strength in her hands, the way she gave of herself without hesitation, the way she made his mother feel less like a patient and more like a person still deeply loved. And it struck him, this was what love looked like. Not power, not wealth, not the endless striving for control. Love was in these small acts, repeated every day, without fanfare. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, as the realization rooted itself in him. He was falling in love with her. Not because she was kind to him. Not because she treated him like a man instead of a billionaire. But because of the way she cared for the woman who had once carried his whole world in her arms. And that truth, fragile and terrifying, was something Alexander Gray could no longer deny. The room was dim, the curtains drawn against the late afternoon sun. Lily sat at the bedside, reading aloud from the same book she had read countless times before. Her voice was steady, almost musical, and Alexander, seated across from her, found himself listening more to her than to the story. It had become a ritual now, the three of them, bound together in silence and waiting. Alexander's gaze lingered on his mother's face. He had grown so used to the stillness that he almost stopped believing change was possible. Hope had become something fragile, something he carried only because Lily seemed to breathe it into the room each day. And then it happened. A flicker. The faintest movement of his mother's fingers against the sheet. Alexander sat forward instantly, his breath caught in his throat. "Did you see?" "I saw," Lily whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes wide with sudden light. She set the book aside and leaned closer, her hand brushing softly against the patient's. "Mrs. Gray? Can you hear me?" For a moment, silence pressed in on them again. Then, with agonizing slowness, eyelids fluttered. His mother's lashes trembled, and a weak sigh escaped her lips. "Mother," Alexander breathed, his voice breaking for the first time in years. He grasped her hand, clutching it as if anchoring her to the world. "It's me. It's Alexander." Her eyes opened, unfocused at first, then finding him. A faint, weary smile curved her lips. And then, astonishingly, her gaze shifted toward Lily. "You," she rasped, her voice faint but clear enough. "My guardian angel." Lily's eyes filled with tears, her hands shaking as she pressed them gently over the older woman's. "No, Mrs. Gray. You're the fighter. I only stayed with you while you remembered how." But Alexander's mother shook her head weakly. Her gaze returned to her son, a look so full of meaning it rooted him in place. "Take care of her," she whispered. The machines beeped steadily, the room holding its breath around them. Alexander felt the weight of the words sink into his chest, anchoring themselves deep inside him. He looked at Lily then, really looked at her, his heart swelling with an emotion he could no longer keep hidden. And for the first time since his mother had fallen into the coma, Alexander Gray allowed himself to believe in miracles. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of light. His mother was weak, still recovering, but awake. Awake. Each time Alexander walked into her room now, her eyes followed him, her smile faint but real. And always beside her was Lily. Alexander found himself watching them together, the nurse and the woman who had given him life, laughing softly over a shared story, Lily coaxing her to take another spoonful of broth, or simply holding her hand when words were too much. It was in those moments that Alexander knew his mother had been right. Lily had been her guardian angel, and without realizing it, his. One evening, when the room was quiet and his mother slept peacefully, Alexander turned to Lily. The lamplight caught in her hair, and his chest tightened with the weight of everything he hadn't yet said. "You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever," he began, his voice low but steady. "You didn't just care for her. You kept hope alive for me, too." Lily's eyes softened, though she shook her head gently. "I only did my job, Alexander." "No," he said firmly, leaning closer, his gaze locked with hers. "What you've done, no paycheck could ever measure it. You stayed when I couldn't believe. You gave when there was nothing to gain. And somewhere along the way he exhaled, a rare tremor in his voice. "I fell in love with you." The words hung in the air, raw and unguarded. Lily's lips parted in surprise, her breath catching. For a moment she said nothing, only studying him with those calm, rain-soft eyes that had unraveled him from the very beginning. Then slowly she smiled, the kind of smile that carried warmth straight into the cracks of his soul. "Alexander," she whispered, "I wasn't looking for this. But maybe love finds us in the places we least expect." Relief and wonder crashed over him all at once. He reached for her hand, not as the commanding CEO, but as a man stripped bare of his power, offering nothing but his heart. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers curled into his, steady and sure. In the silence of that hospital room, surrounded by machines and shadows, Alexander Gray discovered something his billions could never buy. Love born not of glamour or grandeur, but of quiet devotion. A love beyond the silence.